Good afternoon, everybody. I do have a challenge set before me today because the few times I ran through this, I went woefully over time, which I thought would be the opposite problem. So I'll just dive right in. So bear with me, if you will. Brethren, we understand one thing that much of the world doesn't, and it's our worldview. And it's the correct worldview that we all take for granted, and it's the good versus evil. We understand that at the bottom of the barrel, that is the paradigm in which we operate. It's good versus evil, and it's God versus Satan at the end of the day. And we also know that everything Satan does as the prince and power of the air is he is a counterfeiter. He takes everything that is, that's true, or that is reality, and he likes to flip it on its head, or he likes to pervert it. One of the oldest tricks in Satan's bag of tricks is he takes that worldview that we have, that good versus evil, and he uses it for his own advantage, and he divides and conquers. And that's the title of my message today, is Divide and Conquer. Sorry, it's the subtitle of my title. My title is The Oldest Trick in the Book, and then To Divide and Conquer. So my hope today is to show how this is a strategy that has been employed and is currently being deployed in every area of life. Because Satan is currently the prince and power of the air. And he has multiple fires burning simultaneously. Let's turn in our Bibles. Let's go to Genesis 3. We all know the story. Genesis 3, verse 1. But it's worth reading because I feel I've pinned down exactly where this happens. Genesis 3, verse 1. It says, "Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, Has God indeed said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, Ye shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Then the serpent said to the woman, Ye shall not surely die. For God knows that in the day ye eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And I want to highlight the verse, one part of this verse, where Satan's subtlety and his cunning created this false paradigm, this divide and conquer, this perversion and twisting of good versus evil. It's when he said to Eve, "You will be like God." And that is the moment where Satan created possibly some kind of emotion, some kind of me versus him, some kind of I don't have versus what he has, or some kind of victimhood, or some kind of jealousy, like I could attain that, when it was never in the question to begin with. This is where it started. I believe right here is when Satan introduced that idea. Now, in our world, we see this everywhere. It's the same thing, this divide and conquer strategy. It's playing out all over us. The most obvious would be in our own country right now, where the most notable divide is the political one. And I'll spare the details because I'm sure we're all aware of them. And it's easy to fall into one of those camps because typically we tend to agree with one side over the other. It's a very easy trap. But the reality is, if we're honest with ourselves, it's sometimes this group is right, sometimes this group is right, most of the time this group is wrong, and most of the time this group is wrong. So that's a modern day example of this divide and conquer. And let us not forget, Satan's goal originally with the temptation of Adam and Eve, he promised them godhood, you'll be like God, but he actually desired the opposite. He wanted to destroy them. So if we take that as a given here, we could extrapolate out the end result of an increasing divide in whatever situation we find ourselves in. An increasing divide typically leads to burning and destruction on both sides. Another example I'll give is one from history, and it's one Hitler used. Hitler used the strategy of divide and conquer to gain power. And he used two groups, or many groups. He played this group off against this group with racial and religious, and then he used everybody on both sides as pawns in his greater scheme. Nobody won in that situation. If you were on the Nazi side, the German side, 20 million of your fellow Germans died. And if you're on the other side, many more millions died as well. And in the end, nobody benefited. And then also Hitler was destroyed, just like Satan will be. Satan is seeking total world power in the same fashion. And one of the ways this works is both sides get inflated and conflated by emotion initially. And we know, I'll just reference Mark 3:25. Christ told us that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And I'm going to give examples of these dialectics, if you will, these two groupings that are some of them very silly. Ford versus Chevy. It's just a small thing that people will endlessly and mindlessly debate about. And maybe some of you can educate me later, as if that's relevant or not. But to me, it seems like it's my favorite color is blue and yours is red. End of story. But there's more notable ones. There's Catholic versus Protestant. And we wouldn't fit into that divide and conquer camp where they're endlessly fighting. We stand outside of it and see that they're basically arguing on how the deck chairs on the Titanic are being arranged while the Titanic heads towards the iceberg. There's other ones, this NFL team over that NFL team, and Christian versus Muslim. There's all these dialectics, all these divided and conquered, or groups that are divided. Now, Jesus dealt with this in his day as well, and it was Pharisee versus Sadducee. And I suppose in his day, it was the more conservative group over the more liberal group. And I guess I would assume that the Pharisees were the more conservative group because in my mind they seem to have been more rigid in their observance of things. But when Jesus dealt with these camps, they always tried to trick him into arguing what they understood about their camp. And Jesus never indulged it. He never indulged their small arguments like washing of the hands. He never indulged the arguments about how his followers and himself weren't obeying some of their traditions. He always went right to the source, and he always went right to the law. Now I want to give another example just for a little more clarity to hopefully flesh this out a little better if it hasn't made sense so far. And I'm going to use the game of chess as an analogy. So the chief worldview is good versus evil. It's God versus Satan. So imagine two people playing chess. One is God and one is Satan. Well, what Satan likes to do is he likes to take the game, the greater game, fictionalize it, hand it to you, and you have the person on the right playing and the person on the left playing, while Satan is the one overseeing it. Or you could imagine Satan playing Satan while the pawns destroy each other. One thing we need to remember when we're looking at groups or groups of people is that we always have to look at them as individuals. And I'll ask the question, were there any good Pharisees? I believe there were. Nicodemus comes to mind. There was a good Samaritan, even though the Samaritans had some obvious things wrong. When we need to be careful when we look and cast judgment upon a person who seems to be fitting into a group as a whole, because what we understand through our walk with God is that the individual matters the most. And we need to understand that the greater game is for the destruction of both of those things. So now this greater game, we need to be aware is, how is this playing out in my life? Are there false debates? Are there false disagreements? Are there this versus that playing out in my life, whether it be in my marriage, in my congregation, with my friends, that Satan is going to use to destroy you both? When we find ourselves in those situations, whether it's a disagreement with somebody or whatever it may be, maybe we can pause and ask ourselves, am I being used here in a greater game? So what can we do to ward off against this? What steps can we take? And I think it's we hold fast to a greater ideal, and it was laid out for us. We hold fast to love, we hold fast to joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, long-suffering, and self-control. Because whatever we're talking about, whether we're ignorantly debating politics with somebody, or whether we're in a heated argument with a significant other, if we keep our emotions in check with those things, I don't believe Satan has a way in to come into the division and destroy you both over something that he has set up originally, that at the end of the day is really quite silly. So brethren, let us remember and be aware of this plot of Satan, this ploy that is called divide and conquer.